Shalom, friends. This is Rabbi Steve Wiseman of Temple Solel here in Bowie, Maryland, welcoming you to this next edition of our Judaism Unplugged video series as we continue our series of vignettes of Jewish history. This one entitled North by Northwest, as we explore briefly the history of the Northern Kingdom of biblical Israel and its conquest in the year 723 by the forces of Assyria. As we noted at the end of our last historical segment, the unity of the kingship of David and Solomon that lasted for about 77 years was not sustained. Solomon, who was a man of peace, as his name Shlomo indicates, was also a great builder. He inherited the responsibility for building the temple in Jerusalem after God did not allow David to build it because he was a man of war. Solomon was also a man of significant geopolitical persuasion, as according to the folk tales told about him, he may have had as many as 300 wives and 700 concubines, most of those arranged marriages and gifts from surrounding countries that wished to maintain good relations with him. Those wives would have needed their own places to live, and so there was significant building going on throughout the time of Solomon's reign. When Solomon died, his heir sought to maintain the high tax rates on the people that had supported the building program of his father. And there was, according to the biblical text, a popular rebellion, the result of which was the splitting of the United Kingdom into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom got the majority of the tribes, 10 in all, and got to keep the name Israel. The southern kingdom got Jerusalem, the capital, with its temple and the priesthood, and the tribes of Judah and Simeon, along with Levi. And as we noted, this division seems to have occurred, at least within the biblical text, without a significant civil war. And indeed, throughout the period from the end of the 10th century until the destruction of the Northern Kingdom in 723, rare was the time when the northern and southern kingdoms were even at loggerheads with each other, occasionally siding with different neighbors in external skirmishes, but with only one or two notable exceptions ever does the text show any hint of an attempt by one or the other to take control of the other. And that's either very remarkable or very sanitized. And we'll soon be coming to the point where the idea of sanitization may become both possible and practical, as well as desirable. But for this video, we're looking at the Northern Kingdom in the year 723, when it disappeared. The intriguing thing about the Northern Kingdom, was that it needed to create its own capital and its own central shrine if it didn't want to be dependent upon Jerusalem. One of the other intriguing things is that the Northern Kingdom could not maintain a dynasty through more than 3 generations for the entire time it existed. Such was its nature. So where Solomon's son continued as the next ruler of Judah in the dynastic line that started with David, And afterwards, the king of Judah was a consistent single dynasty until the destruction of the south. The north suffered violent turnover at a rather significant frequency for the 200 or so years that it existed as a separate independent entity. One can make the case that the period between 920-ish, when the split occurred, and 723, when the North was captured, was actually a time of Jewish autonomy, but it wasn't a time of Jewish unity. There were two Jewish states, Israel and Judah, each autonomous, according to the biblical text. One no more significant than the other in its own day, apparently. And therefore, it's hard to say that the Jews were completely self-ruling at that time. There were dueling claims to that ultimate Jewish voice. Although intriguingly, with differing priesthoods, different capitals, at times differing calendars, one God under the traditional names remained the same. Even if there is a school of thought that believes that the usage of Elohim was more prevalent in one of the kingdoms, while the unpronounceable name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh was the God name of choice in the other. The core of the religious practice remained monotheism, remained the same God. It was as if there were two nations divided by a worship of a single God. But remember, that's not what divided them in the first place. It was a tax rebellion. It was the inability of the third generation of dynastic heirs to David and Solomon to maintain the unity of the people. So the northern kingdom goes along, and as the northern kingdom, it was the one closer to the Fertile Crescent, where the unrest of the period seemed mostly to be centered, which is not to say during the dynastic period and the monarchical period in Israel and Judah, Egypt was not still a player. It certainly was. It's during this period that the pharaoh Shishak comes up out of Egypt, attacks Jerusalem, and actually takes the Ark of the Covenant into captivity, setting up that magnificent scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is absolutely based on the biblical tradition. It's the last time we see the Ark in Jewish hands, is Shishak taking it back, supposedly to the store city of Tanis. But in the north, every time there was a new power sweeping out of the Fertile Crescent and trying to make inroads and make their way down to Egypt to prove their superiority, they would first have to go through the land bridge between the Fertile Crescent and Egypt, which included Israel and Judah. And if they were coming from the north, then they would get to Israel first. So part of the instability of the northern kingdom compared to the southern kingdom was the frequency with which external invaders were trying to pass through. Israel frequently took the brunt of those salvos, but usually succeeded in keeping the northerners from sweeping through and challenging Jerusalem and Judah. And likewise, on those rare occasions during this period when Egypt swept northward, it was Judah that was in the line of fire first, and they took the brunt. But again, absorbed enough that allowed the northern kingdom not to be hit too badly in those cases. And so it's not surprising that when the end of the northern kingdom comes in 723, it comes out of the Fertile Crescent. It comes at the hands of the Assyrians. And there's a piece of the external history that is terribly important in understanding here. Apparently, the Assyrian way in warfare and conquest was when they defeated a neighboring country, they took as many prisoners as they could, regardless of status, regardless of abilities. So when the Northern Kingdom is destroyed in 723, many of the 10 tribes were taken prisoner and brought back to Assyria. It's important to keep in mind for a couple of reasons. Number one, it may be part of helping to understand why things in the Fertile Crescent passed fairly quickly from the Assyrians to the Babylonians in authority and in control, and then eventually and equally quickly to the Persians, because we have to look at each of their foreign policies and their policies towards taking prisoners and treating vanquished foes, particularly in their relationships with Judaism and Jerusalem. So in 723, Assyria puts an end to the Northern Kingdom, takes much of the population captive and brings them back to Assyria. The rest are forced to either continue in place, unprotected, unruled, or else they were forced to head south and join with their brothers, their cousins in Judah. And it seems there was a mix of both that went on. And it seems there was a significant presence of Jewish slaves in the late days of the Assyrian Empire. But 723, as the fall of the Northern Kingdom, leaving only Judah standing. And Judah would stand for close to another 150 years before it too was captured. With the fall of the Northern Kingdom, Judah is now exposed on both sides, to Egypt from the south and to whoever's coming out of the Fertile Crescent from the north. And indeed, starting as early as 20 years after the destruction of the north, about 700 BCE, during the reign of King Hezekiah in Jerusalem, there is a significant siege of Jerusalem. So significant that the water supply is being threatened. And here we need to take a slight digression and talk about the topography and geography of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a relatively unique ancient Near Eastern city in that it's not a major port. It's not on a major body of water. It's at the top of a mountain. And it's its presence on the top of the mountain that made it so difficult to conquer, made it such a strong fortress. But if one was defending for invaders from the north or the south, in the old days, one would generally send most of their defenses on the roads along the sea. The sea routes were the primary routes. There was a primary inland route that followed the Jordan River and then cut across to the sea route to head to Egypt through Jerusalem. Jerusalem was fed by a series of springs for its water source. It was not a terribly dependable water source. Jerusalem was very dependent upon rain as well. And during the siege in the time of Hezekiah, the water source actually began outside the walls of the city. Hezekiah created a water tunnel that brought the water source inside the city walls so that the citizens of Jerusalem did not have to go outside the walls and risk their safety to get water on a daily basis. It's a rather remarkable building project in that the biblical story is that they started digging from both ends and met in the middle. I've had the privilege of walking the water tunnel. There is a place in the middle where the tunnel turns dramatically, as if it was the place where diggers from two sides met. And according to the history, there was a engraved plaque in the wall honoring that moment where the two sides met, that archaeologists plundered and brought back to the, I believe, to the British Museum. So water, historically, is always going to be a major factor. And Jerusalem is one of those exceptions. It's an inland city, not really on a major water route. But because it's surrounded on three sides by steep valleys and cliffs, it really only had to be defended on one side, which is why when David captured it, it was such a big deal. It's why it made sense for him to make it the capital, because it was relatively easy to defend compared to many other places. But from Hezekiah onward, the last 100+ years of Judah, the southern kingdom, were changed by the absence of the northern kingdom, both internally in terms of additional population and externally in terms of now being surrounded by potentially dangerous enemies and not having that buffer zone that the 10 tribes provided. So when we look in the next video at the fall of Jerusalem in 586, some of these same factors have to come into play. The change in foreign policy to the Babylonians, who destroyed the southern kingdom, from that of the Assyrians, and how that made them more nimble and able to take over Assyria and to capture Jerusalem. And the impacts of Persian diplomacy and foreign policy as well. And why Jerusalem was exposed and why it was able to be conquered in the first place. So 723 would be that fourth point of significant Jewish dates and periods in Jewish history, with the fall of the northern kingdom that changed the biblical world significantly. As always, if you have questions, I look forward to hearing from you. You can send me an email by way of the Temple Solel website, templesolelmd.org. Until we meet again on our next video, I wish you shalom, friends, and we'll see you soon.